introduced, commons are really this cornerstone of utopian thinking, and they're also an important component of constructing food sovereignty. But how they actually work matters, and the experiences and contradictions inherent in that effort have a lot to teach us. So today I'd like to share with you a little bit about a group called the Open Source Seed Initiative that I've been studying as part of the PhD that I completed last year. C.R. Lawn has lived the enclosures of seed. As founder of the Fedco Seeds Cooperative, he saw fungicide treatments become ubiquitous in the 1980s and decided to stop selling seeds laced with these hazardous chemicals. In the 1990s, as GMOs came online, he placed a moratorium on the technology out of concern for unknown risks. 9 years later, when Monsanto bought out Seminis, which was Fedco's largest supplier of vegetable seeds, Fedco began boycotting the company because, Lon explains, we could not, in good conscience, sell their varieties anymore. The chemicals, the GMOs, the patents, Lon says, are part of a broader phenomenon. We have privatized the commonwealth in the hands of the few at the expense of the common good. So many folks encounter the concept of commons through Garrett Hardin's famous 1968 Tragedy of the Commons, and through Eleanor Ostrom, who later called Hardin's bluff, recognizing that what he described was not in fact a well-governed commons, but an open access regime. So Ostrom in turn opened up an expansive field of research on governed commons, and a next generation of scholarship has since extended and applied her principles of design to study different forms of commons, including knowledge and intellectual commons, digital commons, cultural and civic commons, and global commons like the climate and the oceans. So my work connects this body of research to studies of Marxian primitive accumulation, where enclosures are generally recognized as ongoing and dialectically related to resistances by both people and nature. So especially where these studies have focused on social movements, they reveal that rather than thinking about the commons as a resource, this kind of noun, a static entity, it helps to think about commons as a social process. Commoning is a verb, as historian Peter Leinbach says, there is no commons without the insistent activities of commoning. In other words, movements suggest that commons might better be envisioned as a triad. We have the resource, we have the communities, and we have the social protocols that they collectively negotiate, and that gives us commoning as a dynamic whole. So within the Open Source Seed Initiative, I see the resources as seeds, which are a biological and cultural or a biocultural resource. The community are the farmers, social scientists, informal and formal sector plant breeders, and small seed company affiliates who comprise OSSI. And the social protocols are the rules, practices, and norms that these community members shape, and sometimes through some pretty difficult times, as I will try to share with you in a moment. So I'd like to sweep through these quite quickly in three micro cases of unenclosing intellectual property, commoning knowledge, and then struggles with the global seed system. So Frank, I just kind of want to take a show of hands. Who here is familiar with open source software movement, copyleft? Okay, excellent. It basically inverts the copyright license to ensure that everyone has the freedom to copy, modify, and distribute programs as they see fit, as long as they apply the same copyleft license to their creation. And that was really the kind of epistemological inspiration for OSSI. And plant breeder Frank Morton first heard of open source software from his 13-year-old Linux-loving son Taj, and thought it might be a great way to make sure that somebody did not patent an open pollinated seed variety that he had bred and kind of patent it out from under him. So as I learned in my research, Morton and other small-scale amateur farmer breeders have actually long been releasing their own seed varieties into the public domain. But public domain in the US operates more like Hardin's open access regime than Ostrom's governed commons. So if a breeder's varieties are not protected by a utility patent or plant variety protection, they can be scooped up and propertized by somebody else. So in 2011, Morton got together with sociologist Jack Kloppenberg at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Erwin Goldman, a public plant breeder, to explore a solution. And what they devised and began gathering more members around was this idea of an open source seed initiative. They started working with attorneys to craft a legally defensible open source license, and just as in software, the main idea was what they dubbed a protected commons, kind of building on Ostrom there. It would allow for free sharing, saving, replanting, trading, and breeding of seeds, but it would have that one pivotal restriction, the inability to restrict anyone else from doing the same. So what happened though in 2013, just about 2 years on, it was evident that this license approach reached an impasse. The material difference in biological material, like seed from software, meant that breeders don't actually get they don't get a copyright because they've not actually created something de novo. And that made it very difficult legally to flip it into a copyleft creation. It also expanded into these long tracts of legalese, and as a result, farmers who were working with Aussie said that that basically resembled Monsanto's creepy behavior with their long contracts. So kind of culturally, it put them off and looked like pretty much what the gene giants were doing already. As Aussie struggled with that tactical problem, it encountered yet another dilemma, and this time within its own plant breeders. So some of those breeders were arguing in favor of completely freed seed, what they called the zero license. Other breeders in the land-grant university said, we still want to have royalty-bearing licenses because they're dependent on those royalties in a system now where there's massive defunding of agricultural research at universities, and especially in conventional breeding as opposed to biotechnology. So they wanted these royalty-bearing licenses. And Aussie nearly collapsed under the weight of that early conflict. The Organic Seed Alliance, which was a major donor at the time, abandoned the project, and for several months these remaining members faced the prospects of likely defeat. But what happened instead is, rather than give up, they decided instead to abandon the license, and they rallied around a much simpler moral economic pledge. 4 lines on a seed packet that could be easily distributed, not 8 pages of legalese, and it just said this: you have the freedom to use these Aussie seeds in any way you choose. In return, you pledge not to restrict others' use of these seeds or their derivatives by patents, licenses, or other means, and to include this pledge with any transfer of seeds or their derivatives. So this is the pledge that propagates with every packet of Aussie seed today. And on April 17, 2014, in solidarity with International Peasants' Day, Aussie officially relaunched under this pledge, and its 7 breeders celebrated with the release of a few dozen varieties. Now today, and I just checked in with their executive director, Claire Luby, who's on the right here in the slide, they're up to 41 plant breeders, 65 small seed companies, and nearly 500 varieties. So how it expanded to that scale gets to this second question. Is Aussie as a knowledge commons? What is it doing to repossess knowledge, and who owns the expertise within Aussie? So when Aussie began, it was very clear and evident that the center of expertise, this kind of center of gravity, was within formal institutions, the public land-grant universities. Now, people like Carol Deppe, Frank Morton, Jonathan Sparrow, Loretta Sandoval, and Joseph Lofthouse are just a few of the quietly expanding movement of freelance breeders in the U.S., and they've actually stopped calling themselves amateur breeders and used that word freelance in recognition of their own expertise. So, as you can see here, the number of informal breeders have now contributed all but 17 of the total varieties in the Aussie Commons. And this is a snapshot over time. The public sector seeds have just nudged up by 1 since December 2016. So we've got a nudge from 16 to 17, while the seeds coming in from the freelance community continues to grow and grow. It's now 458 out of a total of 475. So I was curious, why is this happening? What is enabling these freelancers to really push the vanguard of a commons in seeds in the U.S.? And part of the reason I found is that Aussie is actually not a really radical ideological shift for many people who are part of existing informal networks like the Seed Savers Exchange, for example. This is a great example of somebody who is part of the freelance community, David Podol, in North Dakota. He says, seeds are a sacred thing. Everything we have built now is built on farmers selecting seed for millennia. All that genetic diversity is a great gift. Seeds should not be owned, patented, or controlled. Hand in glove with that existing culture and ideological stance is an existing practice. So I previously mentioned that freelancers have long been already releasing their seeds into the public domain. So Aussie represents for these freelancers then the chance for potentially more protection over their varieties than that public domain or open access regime, as Frank Morton puts it. So does that mean we should hoard our beans, lock them up with PVP and patents, not allow others to see, breed, or make comparisons to our stuff? That's no fun, and you can't get started in plant breeding with an attitude like that. And so the last major reason that I found freelancers have really been moving into prominence is really the flip side of this equation, and those are the constraints and structural lock-ins that the university breeders now face in public universities in the U.S. They confront a real morass of trade secrets, bag tags, dozens of patents on specific traits, licensing agreements, and contracts. In addition, a critical policy known as Bayh-Dole from the 1980s meant that universities really switched to raising revenue from licensing on genes, traits, and parent lines from the private sector. So, insofar now as Aussie goes against this now entrenched model, it represents not only a potential loss of revenue to universities from a specific variety that a breeder might release into the open source commons, but it really challenges the whole setup, the propertizing of knowledge, the revenue stream from licenses, and the public-private partnerships that increasingly keep universities afloat. So that brings to the final case here. Social movements and peasant organizations and the food sovereignty movement more generally have been very skeptical of this idea of open source seed. And as early as 2011, Aussie's founders met with La Via Campesina in Bali and found that although they expressed some interest, and specifically the younger members, the elders and some of the experts in genetic resources were clear about their misgivings of utility of open source for indigenous and peasant communities. And you can see here a report published by Grain and La Via Campesina in 2015, which explicitly critiques open source licenses as tools of intellectual property and not necessarily appropriate for seeds or for small farmers. And in my interviews with NGOs, peasant organizations, and indigenous rights advocates, I continued to hear similar concerns, even though by this time Aussie had abandoned the license in favor of the pledge. For example, Ramon Vera Herrera of Grain explained to me it's really not about the license or no license. It's the more general problem of reducing social and ecological relations to things. Especially in agriculture, he said, what we call seeds, as you well know, is a vast thread of social relations. And so several concerns grew from that basic disjuncture. The first was a strong association of open source with fungible data and unrestrained movement. In contrast to territorial-based concepts of sovereignty seen among many southern groups, where seeds are rooted ecologically, culturally, and often spiritually, we find in open source an unrooted or aterritorial notion of resources. Second is an issue of science and power. So much scientific manipulation is steeped in hubris, my informants told me, disrespectful and indeed unknowing of the scales and types of transformations it imposes. So due to this viral nature of open source sharing, it's possible that genetically modified crops, synthetic biology products, and now CRISPR-edited organisms could suffuse the seed and crop system, and if so, Aussie would be displacing diverse seeds and agroecological knowledge rather than sustaining them. And finally, I heard about law and governance. So positive law, as developed by Western capitalist societies, one informant told me, tends not to respect customary law, and efforts to translate customary arrangements into positive law often instead undermine them. So any attempt by Aussie to build contracts or pledges would therefore likely follow in this paradigm, pushing out the very types of informal vernacular law upon which commoning thrives. And as a quick example, while certainly preferred by movements to the licenses, the pledge is still boxed into what they call Ivan Illich's radical monopoly. Because it carries these two basic stipulations, to become an open source seed, they require that it must be biologically a new variety, which in plant breeding terms identifiable as selected from a heterogeneous population. And a second stipulation, it must have this individual breeder or agent with the authority to pledge the seed. And these stipulations, while helping Aussie create a chain of custody, are obviously exclusive of certain varieties and certain people. Indigenous seeds, heirlooms, land races, any kind of cultivar that we might understand as intergenerational, communal, and for indigenous peoples, even beings in their own right. So where Aussie is now is they've tried to get beyond that impasse by taking what I see as a more agroecological approach. Rather than viewing the Aussie system as sort of this model that they can go around the world and proselytize about, they're seeing it more as a set of principles that can be locally adapted. And they have inspired the free seed license as part of the Venezuelan seed law. They have made partnerships with Open Access in India and with a group of agroecological breeders in Germany who have been actually developing a license approach. So in this way, I kind of argue that they are in line with what Arturo Escobar calls a pluriverse of commons, which is this intervention that is in line with respecting the sovereignty of local peoples to develop the commons in the means that are usable and appropriate to them. So I think I'll end there. I have a few other thoughts, but I'd like to kind of save those for the conversation. And thank you for your time.